My buddy Jake moved to New York about 3 years ago. First week there, he called me and said something I still think about. He goes, I rode the subway for 45 minutes this morning, standing 2 inches from maybe 40 different people, and not a single one of them looked at me. Not once. And I asked him if that bothered him. He said, that's the weird part. It didn't. Because I didn't look at any of them either. That stuck with me. Because at some point, that became completely normal. Standing in a metal tube, hurtling underground with 100 strangers and everyone just staring at the floor, earbuds in, eyes down, the unspoken agreement that we are all going to pretend the other people don't exist. And I started wondering, when did that happen? Not just in New York, everywhere. When did we collectively decide that the default setting around stranger was to shut down? Because here's the thing, it wasn't always like this, not even close. There's a test research is run on kids, really young kids, 18 months old, some of them. A stranger walks into the room and drops something, a pen, a book, doesn't matter. And the kid, without being asked, without being told, just picks it up and hands it back every single time. They've done this study in Germany, in Peru, in rural India, in Japan. Doesn't matter where the kid is from. Doesn't matter what language their parents speak, the result is the same. Before anyone teaches a child to be cautious, before anyone explains stranger danger, before any of that, the default setting in a human child is to help, to connect, to reach out. We are not born suspicious. That part gets installed later. And to understand when it got installed, you have to go back, way back, to a version of human life that most of us can barely picture anymore. For the vast majority of human history, something like 95% of the time we've been on this planet, people lived in small groups, bands of maybe 30 to 150 people. Everybody knew everybody. You knew who snored, you knew who was generous and who was stingy. You knew everything about the people around you because there weren't that many of them. Now in that world, when a stranger showed up, and I mean a genuine stranger, someone from a completely different group, your first instinct was not fear, it was curiosity, because that person had just walked out of somewhere you'd never been. They knew things you didn't know, where the water was 2 days east, whether the hunting was good past the ridge, what the weather had been doing in the valley below. A stranger was basically a walking news broadcast in a world that had no other way to get information from somewhere else. The Hadza people in Tanzania, one of the very few groups still living close to that original way of life, they still do this. Researchers who have spent time with them describe how outsiders get welcome into camp. Not just tolerated, actually welcome. Food gets shared, space gets offered. The assumption running underneath all of it is that this person is probably fine. That's not recklessness. That's not some naive idea that everyone is good. That's just the setting that worked for hundreds of thousands of years. Open, curious, essentially warm. And then about 10,000 years ago, everything changed. Not because humans changed, because humans invented something that changed the math of being alive. Agriculture. When people figured out they could plant seeds and stay in one place and grow their own food, it was genuinely one of the biggest shifts in the entire history of our species. And almost nobody talks about the weird side effect it had. For the first time ever, humans had stuff worth stealing. Think about that for a second. Before farming, what were you going to take from someone? The memory of where the good hunting spots are? The calluses on their hands? A mobile group of people carry everything they owned on their backs, and if someone took it, they get more. There was no stockpile. There was no surplus sitting somewhere waiting to be grabbed. Farming changed that overnight. Now there was grain in storage, there were animals in pens, there was land that a family had cleared and worked for years. Land that meant survival, and suddenly the stranger walking toward your field wasn't just a traveler with news from somewhere else. They were a question mark, a variable, something you had to assess before you let them get any closer. The walls went up fast. Literally, Jericho, one of the oldest settlements we've ever found, had a stone wall around it, roughly 11,000 years ago. 8 meters tall, a tower you could post a lookout on. Archaeologists originally thought it was flood control. Then they looked at which direction it faced, outward. It was built to stop people. Humans invented agriculture, and less than 1,000 years later, they were building walls to keep strangers out. That's how fast the math changed. But walls only solve half the problem, because a wall tells you who's outside. It doesn't tell you who belongs inside, and that required some something completely new, a way to look at someone and know immediately whether they were one of yours or not. So humans invented identity markers, clothing styles, tattoos, dialects, symbols, rituals that outsiders wouldn't know. Every single thing humans have ever used to signal group membership, all of it traces back to that same moment. The moment when knowing who was in your group became a matter of survival, and your brain adapted to handle it. It built shortcuts, categories, ways to process a stranger in a fraction of a second before your conscious mind even caught up. Safe or not safe, known or unknown, us or them. Psychologists have a name for this: in-group and out-group processing. And here's the part that should genuinely unsettle you. When you see a stranger's face, the part of your brain that detects threats fires before the part that thinks. The suspicion lands before the thought. It feels like a gut instinct. It feels like you're reading the situation, but what you're actually doing is running a piece of software that got written 10,000 years ago for a world that no longer exists. Because in that world, a stranger at the edge of your field really was a higher risk than someone you knew. That caution made sense. It was rational. It kept people alive. But you are not standing at the edge of a field in 8000 BCE. You're on the subway. You're at the grocery store. You're in an elevator. And that same ancient alarm system is still firing. At the person standing next to you in line. At the car behind you that you don't recognize. At the unknown number calling your phone. The system cannot tell the difference between a genuine threat and a completely harmless human being who just happens to be unfamiliar. And the cost of that is real, not theoretical, real. A few years back, researchers at the University of Chicago ran a study on commuters riding the subway. They asked people to do one thing: start a conversation with a stranger on the train. Before it happened, people predicted it would be awkward, uncomfortable, maybe even unwelcome. The actual results were almost the opposite. Almost every single conversation went well. Both people felt better afterward than they had predicted. The strangers were fine, more than fine. They were, in most cases, genuinely glad someone talked to them. The researcher who ran the study said something that I keep coming back to. He said people had developed a mistaken assumption so deep they had stopped questioning it. That strangers don't want to be approached, that the risk outweighs the reward, that keeping your distance is just how things work, and nobody had ever stopped to actually test whether any of that was true. It isn't. We just never checked. Here's what really gets me though. The thing we lost when we stopped trusting strangers wasn't just pleasant conversation on the train. It was something much more fundamental than that. Before agriculture, before ownership, before walls, human groups ran on something anthropologists call a gift economy. You had extra meat today, you shared it. Not because you were keeping score, not because you expected exact repayment. You shared it because that's how the whole system worked. Generosity circulated. Trust was the infrastructure. And it functioned because everyone's reputation was visible in a group small enough that nothing went unnoticed. Agriculture didn't just change what people owned, it changed how people related. It introduced debts, contracts, legal systems designed specifically to allow strangers to cooperate without having to trust each other. Every contract ever signed, every terms and conditions ever written, every security deposit ever collected is, at its core, a workaround for the trust that used to be there naturally. We built an entire civilization out of the assumption that the person across from you probably can be trusted without verification. And we got so good at it that we forgot the assumption was ever a choice. But here's what I keep coming back to. That toddler in the study, 18 months old, stranger drops something, kid picks it up and hands it back. No hesitation, no calculation, no risk assessment running in the background. That's not stupidity. That's not innocence that'll get educated out of them eventually. That's the original code. The one that ran for 300,000 years before any of this. The one that's still in there underneath everything we built on top of it. We cannot go back to living in bands of 150 people. That's not the point. But there's something worth sitting with in the gap between what we assume about strangers and what's actually true about them. Because the subway study says we're wrong.
The toddler study says we started somewhere different. And 300,000 years of human history says that the wall was the invention, not the welcome.